Good afternoon and welcome everybody. Welcome to the AI Policy Conference. My name is Sanja Fabrio. I am a co-founder and managing director of RegHorizon. And I will, together with my colleague Ayisha Piotti and Professor Elliott from ETH Zurich, be a host for these 2 days of the conference. Artificial intelligence, that's obviously the topic, and the policy that regulates it. Artificial intelligence is a powerful tool that carries enormous potential to bring the good to all of us. At the same time, as we know, AI is generating major societal concerns. These cannot be ignored. Concerns that we all have as citizens, as parents, or business people, whatever our background may be. So how do we reconcile those? We tap into the full potential of AI in a way that is good for the society and is good for the economy. Part of the answer lies in policy. Regulation that will uphold trust. After all, it is all about restoring trust. So in order to build an effective and well-conceived regulation, we first need to bring all relevant parties around the table. These must include policymakers, businesses, both small and big, both tech and non-tech, ethicists, social change makers, and civil society. So when Ayisha and I started thinking about this challenge, we realized that we are actually having a great opportunity just here where we are based, in Switzerland, because this is the place where we can achieve this through a collaborative approach. Why Switzerland? Well, it is a global hub for innovation. It has excellent academic institutions, including technology powerhouses, such as ETH Zurich and EPFL. It is a key anchor for a lot of international institutions, clearly with the with the UN just around the corner in the International Geneva. It is also a host to numerous multinational headquarters, so the business selected to be here. It has an unmatched reputation as neutral and very pragmatic country. This led us to create this concept of the conference and to continue building further on it. Therefore, in the next months, we will be focusing on setting up multidisciplinary projects that will be based on some of the identified areas throughout these 2 days of the conference. It will only work, obviously, as a collaborative effort, as nobody can pull it off alone. So as we progress through today and tomorrow's program, please think about the specific needs you have, the challenges that you have when you deploy AI throughout your organizations, or as you use them as citizens. Think about your experience, think about what can you contribute as expertise, and do let us know how you wish to get involved. You will find our contact details in chat and in our website. So here we are at the kickoff of this initiative. And it's great to see such a wonderful makeup of panelists with the experience and expertise from business, from academia, from policymakers, and civil society. And obviously, all of you. And you participants represent truly the globe. We have essentially about a 1/3 from academia, 1/3 from businesses, and a third from civil society and NGOs, and about 12–13% of policymakers. And we have truly representation from all around the globe. Here is the map. So clearly the Europe is very dense, but it's so great to see that we have North and South pretty much represented. So we have US, we have Canada, we have Latin America, Asia, we have Russia, we have India, we have the globe, which obviously says a lot about how relevant this whole topic is. So I really look forward to discussing this today with you and tomorrow, and the prospects of working together going forward. So before we dive into the themes and the structure of these 2 days, with my colleague Ayisha Piotti, I will pass the word to Professor Elliott Ash from ETH Zurich, our partner and co-host of the AI Policy Conference. Elliott.
Thank you, Sanja. As Sanja just mentioned, my name is Elliott Ash. I chair the Law, Economics, and Data Science group at the Center for Law and Economics at ETH Zurich. The Center for Law and Economics is part of the Department of Humanities, Social, and Political Sciences. We're an interdisciplinary research center with 3 professorships, as well as numerous postdocs, PhD students, and scientific assistants. Our research assistant interests are broad, including intellectual property law, law and tech, law and AI, behavioral experiments, and of course, governance. We study these issues using tools from statistics, machine learning, and natural language processing. And within these areas, we're a leading international research center, regularly hosting international conferences like this one, as well as seminars and collaborations with peer institutions across the globe. We're very proud to contribute to this exciting conference and workshop. In particular, I wanted to tell you about, alongside the main conference, an organized set of academic research sessions where we're going to be presenting cutting-edge research in AI governance. We have an international group of scholars from ETH Zurich, EPFL, St. Gallen, Max Planck, Georgetown, Copenhagen, Illinois, and University of Warwick. The topics are broad, including human AI interactions, AI fairness, judge behavior, blockchain, regulation of algorithms, IP, and data protection. The researchers will present short previews of their research to the main conference, but the more detailed presentations and feedback and discussion sessions will be later in the evening. And even for those later academic sessions, all participants are welcome. As Sanja has already pointed out, the issue of AI is critical for policymakers and for business. And I hope you agree that the perspective of academia and researchers is needed to support good decision-making by regulators and by companies. We look forward to a fruitful conversation across these different communities. Now, Ayisha Piotti from RegHorizon will provide more details about how we move forward.
Thank you, Elliott. Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Ayisha Piotti. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of RegHorizon. So you heard from Sanja about why we thought of working on this initiative. The only thing I'd like to add here is that for me, the motivation for this project came from the realization that how we steer AI through policy can truly define the future of our children. However, in order to do so, we need to work together and build an ecosystem of trust and collaboration. So I hope that our conference today is one step towards that common goal. It has been an incredible journey to get to this day, and on behalf of RegHorizon, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partners for all their help and support. More specifically, Professor Elliott Ash from ETH Zurich, with whom we created this concept and with whom we hope to work closely going forward, also to bring to you some concrete solutions. Our sincere thanks also to Logitech, AUS, and the Diplo Foundation for their support. And of course, we could not have made it happen without the participation of our distinguished panelists who represent a truly diverse set of expertise, which is exactly what we need to move forward. So thank you all for being with us today. As Sanja mentioned, we truly have a global conference since we have participants from different parts of the world, including Europe, USA, Africa, Asia. We have an extremely interesting program for the next 2 days. You have the full agenda on our website. Please also see the link in the chat. So I'd like to now elaborate a little bit on how the next 2 days are going to be run. The main conference will run for 2 afternoons from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Central European time. And of course, as Elliott mentioned, you have the possibility to attend the academic paper sessions hosted by ETH Zurich after that as well. Your access link will work for the 2 days, but do remember to log back tomorrow. In terms of content, we'll be dealing with tackling essentially 3 themes: building trust through policy, geo-harmonization of policy, and building the future together. And we will see how these three things come together in one sector with the example of healthcare. So do join that session. That is for tomorrow afternoon. In terms of format, we'd like to make the sessions as interactive as possible. Almost all the sessions are Q&A based. This means that we are looking forward to your questions and your comments. Please post them in the chat, and with the help of my colleagues, we will bring these questions into the debate. You will also have a possibility for more privileged discussions with panelists through additional sessions during the coffee breaks. You will be directed to a separate chat room for that, so please do avail this fantastic opportunity. Your views are important for us, and all through the conference, we will be running polls about the issues related to AI policy. We plan to include the results in the summary publication with ETH Zurich and also for our future work. So please do participate and make sure that your voice is heard. As Sanja mentioned, another objective of the conference is also to build on our discussion by setting up specific projects which you can participate in going forward. So do keep that in mind as you listen to the different sessions, and do contact us if you are interested in participating in any of them. We will also elaborate more on that towards the end of the conference. So now I wish you all a great 2 days of ideas exchange. I hope that at the end of these 2 days, you will walk away with tangible insights, which will be helpful for you as a business leader, an academic, a public servant, and most importantly, as a citizen. So that's all for me. I will now yield the floor to Dr. Katharina Höne to kick off our very first panel on how AI policy can help foster innovation and growth. The floor is yours, Katharina.
Thank you so much, Ayisha. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's even more so a pleasure to moderate the very first panel on fostering innovation and growth. I won't say much on kind of introducing the topic because we have an excellent set of speakers to do that for me and to kick off the discussion. Just to very briefly introduce them. We have with us Katarzyna Gorgol, who is the Digital Affairs Advisor at the EU's delegation to the UN. Dr. Jochen Friedrich, who leads IBM's Technical Relations Europe team, which manages IBM's Standardization Coordination Program in Europe. Dr. Jovan Kurbalija, who's the founding director of Diplo Foundation and the head of the Geneva Internet Platform. Aldo Podesta, who is currently the CEO of L2F, based at the EPFL campus in Lausanne, Switzerland. Christian Busch, who works in the Innovation Unit at the Swiss State Secretariat for Education, Research and Innovation. And last but not least, Dr. Chrisley, who is the director of the Center for Cognitive Science at the University of Sussex and is an advisor for the ethics working group of Neurotech. As Ayisha and Sanja mentioned, we want to make this debate as interactive as possible. I have one first question prepared for each of our excellent speakers, but after that, we would like to enter into a dialogue with you. This means we're looking for your questions and your comments, which you can post in the chat here. And together with my colleague, Natasha Perutica, I will bring these questions and comments back into the discussion to hear from our expert speakers and to develop the topic further, to really distill these insights that will take us further. Speaking of interactivity, we would like to kick off with a poll for you. So you should now see this on your screens. And the question we are asking you is, the biggest challenge on the way to effective AI policy and regulation is, you have three options. The first options, policymakers do not understand the technology, nor do they understand the business environment. Second option, policy inevitably harms innovation and growth. It is simply too early in the development of the technology. Third option, not all relevant stakeholders are involved in the process. Some of these options are provocative on purpose, but it's really interesting to see the results here coming in. I'm just going to give 1 or 2 more seconds. So if you haven't casted your vote yet, last chance. Okay, let me end the poll here and share the results. So given that question, almost 50% of you, the majority, argued that the problem we're facing at the moment is that policymakers do not understand the technology, nor do they understand the business environment. And I think this conference and this first panel is certainly one of the ways to remedy that situation. 45% of you argued that one of the concerns is that not all relevant stakeholders are involved in the process. And again, looking at the makeup of the panel we have here, this is certainly something we are addressing already at this very conference. So thank you so much for sharing your very first impressions in this poll. And again, let me remind you, we're looking for your questions and comments in the chat. But now let me turn to our speakers and enter into a discussion with them to be able to draw on their expertise. I would like to first turn to Katarzyna, and my question for her is, based on your experience at the EU, is there such a thing as an effective AI policy? And if there is, what are the key elements of that policy? Over to you, Katarzyna.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Katharina. Good afternoon, dear organizers, panelists, and participants of the AI Policy Conference. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to kick off the first panel of the very interesting conference. The poll and the results of the poll put me in a very challenging position as a policymaker, I have to say. But let me try and elaborate a bit on your question. So in the EU, we believe that effective AI policy is indeed possible, and it is the policy which successfully promotes responsible innovation. And like Sonia mentioned in her introductory remarks, AI is, of course, a strategically important technology which has tremendous potential for the society, for the businesses. It can really make our lives better and easier, but it is also it can also be a very intrusive technology, which can, those far-reaching consequences of AI also mean that it has to be properly managed and steered in the right direction. And let me briefly elaborate on how we see this policy in the European context, especially with the white paper on artificial intelligence, which was published by the European Commission in February 2020. So this document actually frames our policy around 2 objectives. The first one is to create an ecosystem of excellence on AI in Europe, which means that building on our strength in research and development, on our excellent universities, on vibrant startup ecosystem, and on established industrial position, we want to use AI to upgrade European economy even further. How is this going to be done? First of all, we have to make the full use of European research programs, such as, for instance, Horizon Europe. And secondly, we have to encourage the private sector to invest in AI made in Europe. And just to give you an example, this work has already started. For instance, the EU research funding on AI has increased by 70% over the last 3 years. But of course, we know that we are still behind international partners or competitors in other parts of the world. So this is going to rise even more in the coming years. Another thing that is very important is to help SMEs in their transition towards AI, and also to encourage public authorities to use AI. And data is obviously a very important part of the policy. We are aware that we have to make more data available for AI testing and training in Europe, and we also have concrete actions in this area. And the second part of the white paper policy is what I called earlier, creating the ecosystem of trust. And this means that, of course, new AI-based services, they have to be trustworthy, they have to be robust, they cannot discriminate. And it is not an idealistic argument, nor is it the one against innovation, but simply we think that people will only use AI when they can trust it. And this is where we come to the regulatory aspects of the European policy. But since this is only an introduction now, I will, for the sake of time, not go into details, but I'm happy to come back to regulation in the Q&A part. And to conclude this short introduction, I would like to say that the process of developing policy is also very important as such. First of all, it has to be inclusive. We have to speak to the widest possible range of stakeholders. Secondly, we have to have very good communication channels with businesses. And in the EU, we have been putting a lot of effort to establish such communication channels, for instance, through the European Alliance on Artificial Intelligence, or by engaging in broad public consultations. And thirdly, the international aspects of the policy are also very important, because we have to look in the future and towards a possible convergence of our approaches at international level. And therefore, I'm very pleased today to be a part of this event, which is both international and very business oriented. So that's it for the introduction, and I would like to hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much also for providing this European perspective. And what I really note from your quick introduction is this idea of the ecosystem of trust, that people will only use AI and be happy to use it if they can trust it. I'm sure that's something we will come back in the discussion. You also mentioned multiple stakeholders and the need to involve all of them. And that actually brings me to our next speaker to kind of look at it from the perspective of the tech sector, of companies. This brings me to Aldo Podesta, the CEO of, what was it, L2F. And Aldo, from the perspective of an entrepreneur, is policy that does not harm innovation and growth possible? And what do you make of the argument that regulation can put some countries or regions at a competitive disadvantage? I'm really looking forward to hear your perspective on that. Over to you, Aldo.
Sure. Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Let me also thank Sanja and Ayisha for organizing this event and inviting me. I think it's extremely relevant topic in this moment where we see AI being more and more adopted, more and also not only at the corporate level, but also within public organizations. So we see this as being a very relevant topic to behold right now. How we regulate that, and if we are ready to regulate that right now. Now it may sound indeed a burden from the entrepreneur perspective, creating processes and regulating AI-based systems, but from an entrepreneur's perspective, when you listen about this, you say, okay, that's time consuming. First of all, it will take time, and it will also stretch my go-to-market. For example, when I'm working on a product based on AI, it may stretch the time required to go to the market. But in certain cases, it may also affect my sales cycle and the length of my sales cycle, my unique selling points as an entrepreneur, as a company, but also as probably as a service provider to a company that wants to put together an AI-based software. So when you listen to it from an external perspective without thinking about the implication of that, you may say, okay, it's a real burden and it may create problem for me as an entrepreneur. But, and I think that's the interesting part. When you think about regulations, you believe that they are meant for, from an ethical perspective, ensuring that certain ethical principles are respected. On the other hand, you believe, and I think that regulations are meant to increase the quality and make sure that there is a certain quality level in a specific ecosystem, or on a specific product, service, or whatever. So, and this is really lacking in AI today, and in my opinion, is bringing some problems. There is a wide range of quality among different service providers, but also among different products, among different software. So I see very, very large significant benefits coming from a centralized European, for example, regulation or country-specific regulation. It would really allow us not only to respect certain ethical principles, but also to increase the quality standards of the overall industry, service providers, software companies, and so on. And so this will increase at the end of the day the trust in AI by the end users, and that would be amazing because it will increase the overall business around AI. Meaning that I still see today in many customers we work with some resistance on deploying AI-based systems in a specific sector, for example, or for a specific use case, because they don't understand how it works. They don't understand the results coming from AI-based systems. They don't understand there is a lack of understanding the technology itself. So a bit of distrust on the technology, and a bit of natural prudence as well on deploying something based on AI. So increase the trust in AI to me is a key topic here, and this is what regulation would bring. Now, on the other hand, I also think that it is extremely great from an economical perspective. It will also create new business opportunities for new entrepreneurs to come. So regulation technologies or regulation-related companies are themselves would become part of the AI ecosystem as a significant player, and I believe this is a nice opportunity in terms of job creation. Okay, now we keep thinking what are going to be the jobs looking like in the next 200 years with AI taking over, automating systems and so on. I think that we will be capable of creating a significant number of jobs through businesses related to regulation. Now, last word, and as a side note, really as a citizen more than as an entrepreneur, since I understand a bit how these algorithms work, and also in production, I've been seeing this technology being used on multiple use cases. I think that some of them, and at the EU level, and the OECD already has identified, different type of AI systems. When you think about the targeting software on social media that is capable of better selecting audiences for your products, that's a sensible thing. It may affect, as we saw in the past, it may affect, for example, democratic processes. But when you look, for example, at internal demand forecasting system to predict the demand for my product, probably that's less affecting the society. So for those critical applications, which may be credit scoring, risk assessment of individuals, targeting software, as I said, that have been a big topic over the last years affecting democratic processes. I think that those ones, as a citizen, are the ones I really want to have a strict regulation on from an ethical perspective as well.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And what I really noted was linking regulation to increasing trust, to quality, to these kind of really big concerns that are also concerns of the tech sector. From the chat, we already entered into a very interesting discussion there. So a reminder for our audience to please keep the comments and questions coming. In the chat, I also saw mention of discrimination, and this also links back to regulation, I think, to ensure the non-discrimination of these kind of systems. Thank you so much, Aldo. And I think this seamlessly leads us to our next speaker, Jochen Friedrich.
Elaborate during the coffee break, if anyone is interested. Thank you very much.
Definitely, we will have time for that, and it's a good reminder that we will have chance for a more informal discussion just after this session. But to our next speaker, Jochen Friedrich from IBM, and here I want to dig a little bit deeper into the question of regulation. So to kind of take this a notch further, I want to ask, can regulation help to manage business risks in the area of AI? And is that even possible? So for example, is the certification of algorithms to manage risks and to build trust even feasible? And if yes, how can we actually start doing this faster and in a better way? I'm looking forward to your insights, Jochen. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, I would also like to thank everybody for organizing this, the organizers, and indeed, Switzerland is a great place to have this. For several reasons, also for IBM, we have our research lab in Zurich that do a lot of work on AI as well in IBM. And you have also next to Lausanne, you have ISO, the International Standards Organization that has its headquarters in Switzerland. And where I work a lot with, you heard I'm responsible for standardization and technical regulation in Europe for IBM. And I would like to approach this question about regulation via standards. On the one hand, we want to have very high standards for AI. And if I mean standards, in the common sense of using the word, we want to go to having technical standards. And a lot of what you asked, or what we already talked about in these sort of roughly 20, 30 minutes, is already going on in standardization. We are working in ISO on standards for trustworthiness of AI, on standards for explainable AI, on standards to prevent bias, to look at the data. All of this work is going on, and it has been evolving over the last years enormously. Huge portfolio of standardization activities going on. You also have in IEEE, I should not ignore this, a big global program about ethics and AI with standards. You had, from the European Commission, initiated the high-level expert group on AI, with something like 30, 35 experts working out clear recommendations, including an assessment catalog of what trusted AI means. So we do have all of this grunt work. And at the same time, I'm very much with Aldo before, who said, if we talk about regulation, we need to understand where does regulation make sense. And definitely in areas that are identified as highly critical, where there is critical impact, be it for democratic decision-making, be it for the application where AI is used, critical infrastructures, for instance. Here we need to see whether new regulation is necessary, or whether we already have the regulation in place, and whether AI needs to be designed in a way to meet these regulations. There are, for instance, currently discussion at European level about product safety and artificial intelligence. And I believe there is a big convergence towards saying the product safety regulation and what is in place here is fine. It has the necessary requirements for the marketplace. So looking at AI does not mean to totally rewrite the regulation, but design the AI systems in a way so that the regulatory requirements are met. And the Commission also announced in the white paper is discussing about a general AI regulation, a basic AI regulation in some way. And maybe there are areas where it makes sense, like data, ownership of data, etc. There is a lot to clarify. GDPR meeting this when you look at AI systems, collecting training data, etc. There are many interrelated areas that need careful discussion. I'm not sure whether regulating algorithms is really possible, whether it's desirable. What is desirable is to have, as I was saying, clear standards about the input data, so that whenever about the bias, about the outcome, so whenever you use AI in your company, be open about it. Tell your customers that you use it. Don't hide it. Tell everybody we are doing this supported by AI systems, and be ready to explain how your results are coming about. And in the end, we are not looking at sort of robots that take decisions. We are looking at AI augmenting intelligence. We prefer to say augmented intelligence to artificial intelligence in IBM, but we haven't been successful yet to get there. But leave the decision making to the people, right? And that's what I love. I mean, if we see we've come a long way. Currently, we are testing in IBM debating with AI systems. There have been some public tests. And that's the next step. If I have a system that, if I make a decision that can tell me, are you sure? Or I can ask the system, are you sure? Have you also considered this or that? And then it gets back to me. That's a bit of future highlighting. But in general, I would say regulation, look at the high risk areas. What needs to be done there, if at all? Look at current regulation. Does this already cover the necessary policy requirements? And if not, does it have to be complemented in some way? At the same time, promote international standards so that everybody using AI can refer to these international standards that are available, and you know what you have, what you get, and how the processes are to apply AI, how the governance is to apply AI. Thanks very much so far for the beginning.
Thank you, Jochen, and I'm really looking forward to hear more about IBM Debater and the developments in this area. I think also a great reminder that first it's about applying existing regulation, and that a lot of these discussions on regulation, as you mentioned, are already ongoing. And I also take from your intervention the term augmented intelligence, and I think this is also something worth coming back to in the discussion. I would like to turn to our next speaker and kind of zoom out a bit and ask for general reflections almost on what we heard so far. And this brings me to Ron Chrisley, as I mentioned, director of the Center for Cognitive Science. And Ron, the question I have for you is basically, how do we balance regulation and innovation? We heard from a number of stakeholders here, but I'm really interested in this more zoomed out perspective. So how do we balance this? And what are the specific challenges for achieving this balance, if it's possible, in the area of AI? What do you think?
Well, I want to start by thanking Ayisha and Sanja for inviting me to speak here. This is a very fascinating event, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it. But concerning your particular question about the balance between regulation and innovation, I mean, I'm tempted to just say the specific challenge that AI poses is just that the stakes are so high. But that's a little bit too quick and a bit too obvious. Slightly less obviously, I think some of the challenges about finding this balance have to do with the fact that these days AI is such an inclusive term. People use it to mean not just what I would consider AI proper, but also, well, often any technology involving big data, automation, statistics, or even just algorithms. Then we're already in the area of AI, according to some discussants. And that can be good if it results in us having a long overdue consideration of the regulation of these areas. So I'm not opposed to that. But the drawback of such an inclusive notion is that people sometimes end up talking past each other. There's confusion, there's misunderstandings. And unfortunately, I think this occurs sometimes in discussions of governance and regulation policy about AI. So that's one challenge. But more importantly, I think the lack of clear distinctions, or maybe there are distinctions around, but the lack of agreement on these distinctions, it limits often, I think, the precision and the variety of instruments that we can use in our proposed policies. So, but actually we need precision in our regulations and our approach to policy. And we need a variety of regulatory tools if we really are going to walk this tightrope between preserving our values and our ethical principles on one hand, and yet encouraging the development of new AI technologies on the other. And I think that's especially ironic because it seems likely to me and to a lot of others that the development of these new technologies could play a major role in helping us achieve our values. It could help us achieve our highest ambitions of fighting climate change and providing breakthroughs in health and nutrition and providing high quality education for all. It would be very ironic if a lot of our ambitions and our values were stymied by inappropriate regulation. So we want to find a balance. But even when people are more careful and are just talking about AI specifically, I think that they often just focus on the particular kinds of architectures and methods that are currently, although justifiably, receiving lots of attention right now. And I think, and it can be difficult for people when considering policy and governance to think about AI in a more general sense that isn't just so focused on the technologies of the moment, and include approaches that are not yet here, but are only on the horizon, you might say. It's difficult, but we really must do that. We've seen that AI can develop and transform our societies at a breakneck speed and not always for the good. And we've seen the unfortunate consequences of policy lagging too far behind these developments. And I think it's only, it's very likely that it might get worse if we're not careful. So yes, we need to preserve innovation while simultaneously solving what are now relatively familiar regulatory problems of data privacy, security and ownership, transparency and fairness, impact on employment. Yes, those are all valid concerns, but we also, especially at meetings like this, we need to anticipate about how we will walk the tightrope for the next generation of AI systems. We need to, for example, we might need to think about the regulatory challenges concerning AI systems that plausibly compromise our autonomy. So we need to think about how can we deal with that in a regulatory framework. What about AI systems that don't just produce deep fakes of passive images, voices, and videos, but are faking interactive conversations, of which I think GPT-3 is just a mild foretaste. I think we can expect that to be very big very soon. So we need to be thinking ahead about these next generation AI systems. And finally, I think a complication to this balancing act between innovation and regulation for AI, and that's unique to AI, is that some AI technologies will themselves be aimed at fostering innovation, whether it's creativity enhancing artificial assistance, so there's your augmented intelligence for you, or AI guided investigations into the pharmacology of creativity, or, as we already have now, AI managed startup investment portfolios. In these cases, we'll have to be doubly careful about how our policies impact innovation.
Thank you so much for this great overview. It's really interesting because Jochen mentioned that companies need to be transparent about the use of AI. And Ron, I think you issued a great reminder that we need to also unpack this term if you want to make effective policy, meaning what do we actually mean when we talk about AI, and then also not just looking at the things that are currently hot topics and currently debated, but also look into the future, which is a huge challenge for policymakers, for everyone, but also for policymakers. That's why I want to bring in our next speaker, who again can reflect more from the policy making side. So this brings me to Christian Busch from the Swiss State Secretariat for Education, Research and Innovation. We already heard that Switzerland is actually a great place to bring different stakeholders together and to foster innovation in AI. But then more specifically, Christian, I want to ask, what are the priorities for Swiss AI policy, and how do you make sure to listen to all relevant stakeholders within this setting? I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Katharina. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for setting up this very spectacular event. And I'm very grateful for the invitation. And it's a great privilege to be on this panel today. So what are the priorities for the Swiss government? Now, first, of course, the Swiss Federal Council recognizes the considerable potential that AI has for new business models, for new applications in many, many areas, but also for a substantial possible contribution to solving or addressing societal challenges. So in effect, the main objective of the Swiss AI policy is to ensure best possible framework conditions for AI research, for innovation, and for the use of AI applications. However, at the same time, of course, we also want to ensure that the specific challenges and problems of AI, of course, including transparency, bias, discrimination, liability, and things like that, are addressed in an appropriate manner. Now, while I think many countries would agree on this sort of general objectives, our approach also differs a bit from many other countries, and I would like to just mention 3 points. Much of it has already been addressed before, so I agree with some of the former speakers. Now, the first point has to do, of course, we shouldn't forget competencies in education and research. The second is our sort of general approach for the government in Switzerland, and the third has to do with, of course, how would you regulate new technologies in a general manner. Now, first, when dealing with new technologies for the Swiss government, it's always very crucial to ensure competencies in education and research. I think that's also a point that relates to what Ron has said about GPT-3. I mean, it's a part of the answer of addressing this is maybe regulation, but of course it's as important to ensure competencies in education and ensure people are able to deal with these new challenges also in a private way. So in effect, our conception in Switzerland for education and research, and also for the economy, is that we tend to leave a larger degree of freedom to the actors than in some other countries. So in effect, when we started looking at the issue of AI, we have realized that many actors, or actually most of the actors, especially in research, but also in the private sector and also in education, had already started or had already heavily invested in AI. So we believe sort of a trust in the actors is a good starting point, and is something that has proved to work well in the context of AI in Switzerland. And I think it also contributes to the good overall position of Switzerland that you see, for instance, in research. Second, now our general approach at the government. Now we believe there's not one AI. So from a government or regulatory perspective, it's a totally different issue whether you deal with self-driving cars, with the development of new medical treatments, or the use of AI in job applications. So in fact, when we looked at the challenges of AI for the federal government, we actually identified close to 40 priority areas of action for the time being. However, we also believe these issues have to be addressed within specific sectoral policy areas. So the challenges of each of this AI application is a totally different thing. And we abstained at the federal government from identifying priority areas. We even abstained as one of the few countries from defining an overall AI strategy. A third, just very briefly, very complex issue of how to regulate AI. But again, just a very important point that has been mentioned before. We found in Switzerland that the existing concepts of the Swiss law provided already a great deal of flexibility to accommodate many of the new issues that arise with AI. Of course, there are new issues that we talk about, but for some of the aspects that are often discussed within the context of AI, such as discrimination, liability, transparency, we need to acknowledge that many existing regulations already apply to AI. You could turn it around. You could say, well, the use of AI is actually only permitted subject to the application of these existing laws. But there's a more general point to be made here, which is what we call technology neutrality. So in Switzerland, we try, or we believe government should be as neutral as possible to new technologies. So one example what this means in practice is that when you try to regulate new technologies, try to avoid the technology as such, but try to treat comparable activities and risks equally. So we believe actually the problems that are associated, or the challenges that are associated with AI, actually do not come from the technology as such, but from some of the applications that are becoming possible through this technology. So, of course, this is a very rough compass, and there are numerous exceptions where overriding policy interests have command a different approach, and of course there are issues that are newly regulated. Mainly, of course, in the center is currently the data protection law in Switzerland that's being revised. But still, we believe for enabling innovation and growth, so coming to the general theme of our panel, it's important to try to stick to such principles as much as possible. Now,
thank you so much, and also thank you for giving us this very, very great and broad overview touching on so many different issues. I also was really fascinated to hear this this great relation to what Ron said about unpacking AI, where you mentioned that regulation has to be sector specific and how you approach that in Switzerland. I also really appreciated the reminder about education and the importance of education. I think this is something we need to keep in mind as we debate policy making and regulation as something that almost is the foundation. So now that with your contribution, Christian, that we zoomed into one specific country and the policy within that country, I would like with our last speaker to kind of zoom out again and kind of take an international or global perspective. This brings me to Jovan Kurbalija, the head of Diplo Foundation. And this is, I think, not just a debate between developed countries and not just a debate between highly industrialized countries. Ideally, it's a debate that involves everyone. And that's why I have the following question for Jovan. Can you imagine AI policy that addresses issues such as the digital divide and avoids putting small and developing countries at a disadvantage? And if there is such a policy or such an approach, what are the cornerstones of that? Jovan, over to you.
Thank you, Kat. It's really last 40 minutes proven, Ayisha and Sanja, that your initiative and topics that you have chosen are both timely and excellent. Therefore, congratulations from my side. And I think in the statements before me, more or less all building blocks for the nice tapestry that we may create today are there. From Johannes' focus on standardization to Ron's focus on precision. And I cannot agree more, because one of the major problems currently in digital policy in general, but in AI in particular, is confusion. Terminological confusion, conceptual confusion, and it could be nice discussion for linguistical circle to what it is, but it is now making spillover into policy processes. Because suddenly you have data, cyber diplomacy. I'm quite involved in diplomatic field. And when you ask people what do you discuss, there is whole confusion. Now, what really concerned me was that this confusion exists in business, in tech field as well. Out of the all companies registered which have AI in title or description in the United Kingdom, 43 has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. Therefore, that's something that we have to be very careful. It happened already with blockchain. 3 years ago, blockchain was solution for all problems of the world. Today, blockchain, with exception of Bitcoin, almost disappeared from discussion. Therefore, that's one point. Now, back to your question, Kat. AI is amplifier of digital divides. And that's clear statement, like digital technology has been. Now, you have two logic. One logic is that the situation in developing countries is improving, which is the case, but the gap between developed and developing countries is increasing. And digital divides exist everywhere. It's not only the question between North and South or Africa and Europe and the United States. They exist within the countries. They are across generations, across the professions. And I think if you unpack developments in the current developments in the United States, you will find quite a few digital divides as potential explanation of the sum of the dynamics that is happening currently in the United States. There are another narrative which is dominant is, okay, developing countries will create the tools that will solve your poverty, health, agricultural problems. Just use these tools. Don't ask too many questions. They're powerful. You will live better, you will longer, and you will have a nicer life. This is one narrative which is, in my view, very risky and dangerous, because it is, and it is already we are hearing from developing countries, it can be some sort of new type of colonialism. The second point, which is extremely important, is that developing countries, small and developing countries, are completely out of the global negotiations and discussion on AI. Not only on AI, I would say also data, and to a large extent on digital issues. Therefore, there is no buy-in. There is simply understanding that something important is going on. There is some important party. We are not at that party, which already creates a bit of frustration. But we should try to get to this party. Those are more or less two major narratives. One narrative is this will give you AI tools and life will be better. The second narrative is the narrative of the absence of developing countries, small and developing countries, from policy processes. But I'll get back to one point that divides exist everywhere, and I will bring a very concrete example of a Diplo Foundation. We started creating a software for generating diplomatic speeches. Not very exciting project, but usually those speeches are long and boring, but we are trying to we can share the link to this software. We tried to use GPT-2. At that time, it was open source. And we were a bit shocked and a bit perplexed with the media hype around GPT-2 and relatively low usability. We faced immediately problem of hardware. For example, for us, we are a small organization, it was next to impossible to have a hardware to process GPT-2, let alone GPT-3. And we try to get in touch with OpenAI. By the way, this is a misnomer. It's not anymore OpenAI. It's quite close. You don't know what's going on under the bonnet, but it's another topic for discussion. But simply hardware to process, we put graphical cards, was impossible to use. Therefore, idea of development in garage, which is underlying ethos of the internet and digital development, is disappearing. It helped us to some extent because we couldn't have that hardware. We then combined about 12 algorithms from Chinese to US to create this application, which is now generating speeches. Therefore, that is very, very serious discussion. We are getting back to the simple processing and hardware capability. And I will conclude with one proposal. Few speakers, Christian, Ron, Johan, and the others indicating, hey, we have rules, policies are existing, Cassia as well, let us apply that. And this is a great approach. Discussion on ethics and AI can confuse the overall scene. Let us discuss ethics and AI, but let us apply rules that exist. In this toolkit of existing rules and policies, I will add one important segment. It is the collection of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They have very detailed indicators. They deal with health, with poverty, with urbanization, with climate change, you name it and you have it. It's a mapping of the global system. Why not to use SDGs as one toolbox or toolkit for the AI developers to see how their tools and applications relate to, let's say, reduction of poverty, inclusion of diversity, youth inclusion, women inclusion, and there are almost 200 specific indicators. Therefore, in brief, yes, AI is increasing digital divides, not only between North and South, but also within the societies. Let us introduce reality check and let us use existing laws, policies, and, if possible, sustainable development goals as guidelines for development of AI applications. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jovan. I think one important reminder was the importance of bringing developing countries to the table, bringing them into the discussion as a very first step. I also take that many discussants in the panel really emphasized the application of existing regulation and existing laws. And last but not least, one comment I found really interesting was to take a framework that is already existing, the Sustainable Development Goals, and use it as a guidepost for future developments in artificial intelligence and for assessing developments in artificial intelligence. With that, we conclude the first round with our speakers. And now it's time for your questions and comments. The chat has been extremely lively with many insightful comments and questions. I cannot manage this on my own. That's why I have help from one of my colleagues, Natasha Perucica, who will summarize for us what has been happening in the chat and will bring some of the questions that have been raised there into this discussion. Over to you, Natasha. What have you seen so far?
Hi, Kat. Hello to everyone. I would just like to say that actually the chat discussion has stayed in tune with the contributions of our speakers, which is something very interesting. And it kicked off with reflections on trust. So in relation to what Katarzyna said about trust in and use of AI, David Kai asked, what do we mean when we say people? Then Marcelo Fini raised a point saying that people are not even often are not even aware of what we mean, what using AI means. Anna then brought in another aspect pertaining to trust, and she said that we need to make sure that AI is not discriminatory. We also have opinions shared by Nicholas Grunder, who raised the point about education on AI, and he noted that it can help achieve trust by helping people understand the potentials and implications of AI. There was also an observation from Marisa, who noted that how to increase trust in AI is actually the wrong question, and we should be asking ourselves questions on trustworthiness. She said that the two concepts, trust and trustworthiness, are distinct, and that trust is an attitude, whereas trustworthiness refers to the properties and characteristics of a product. She therefore said that the relevant question that we should raise is, how can tech companies demonstrate that they are trustworthy? On regulation, that was also discussed by our speakers. Nicholas agreed with Dr. Christian Busch by saying that the existing regulations already apply to AI. He added that this is where it is important to make the distinction between the current and immediately foreseeable capabilities of AI with sci-fi scenarios. And then the two questions that seem to be the most relevant for our speakers come from Olga and from Shah. Olga asked whether the regulation of AI in some areas would increase the chance of positive impact by going beyond regulated functions, while Shah asked how can AI innovations be used for social good. That would be all from the chat so far.
Thank you so much, Natasha. So as we said, a very, very rich discussion. And as you said, Natasha, kind of keeping in tune with what we've been discussing in the panel so far, which is great. I would like to give the floor to all of our speakers for their comments and reactions to what we just heard, what's been happening in the chat, and also maybe comments and questions on each other. For simplicity, I would like to go in the order of the speakers as we had them in the beginning. So I would like to start with Katarzyna for your comments, reactions, very briefly, of course, because time is short, as always, with a great discussion. But what is your sense? What are your reactions so far? Yeah. Katarzyna.
Thank you. Thank you for this very, very exciting exchange. I would like to comment briefly on the regulatory aspect and also on standardization. So first of all, full agreement that existing regulations apply to AI. It's not a Wild West. It's not a vacuum. And if we look how courts deal with AI-related cases, you will see that they actually apply GDPR or, for instance, the European Convention on Protection of Human Rights. So there is already a very rich body of rules that exists. Now, when it comes to the potential regulatory gaps that we have been thinking in the context of the AI white paper, they are not only sector specific, but they may also be horizontal. And just to give a few highlights, a few ideas, what we have been thinking of is whether there is a need for requirements on training data, because training data is such a key component of AI, and it needs to be inclusive. It needs to be of a high quality for the AI systems to function properly. Another issue is the level of accuracy. Like Jovan mentioned that sometimes maybe some stakeholders may have a tendency to say, yeah, we have this great AI tool, it's good for you, use it. It's not only that, there's also a responsibility to say to users, what are the levels of accuracy, for instance. Or another issue is transparency, that we as users of AI should be able to know when we are dealing with AI systems. So this is already briefly described in our policy documents, and I invite you to have a look at them if you are interested in more details. When I spoke about people, I think the question from David K was to me. I actually should have said stakeholders. Stakeholders will only use AI when they can trust it. And by this, I mean individual users, business users, public administration, everyone basically. And my question relates to the relationship between standardization and regulation, because in my current work, I also deal with international standardization organizations in Geneva. And I can see that there is a lot of work on AI-related standardization. And I'm wondering if, in particular, Joachim, if you see a risk of regulatory safeguards being circumvented by standards, because actually standards and regulations, they are developed in a different way, while laws, they follow legislative process with parliaments, with public consultations, etc. Standards are developed by a group of specialists. But if in the AI field, it's actually standards which are getting more important, do you see a risk that we could, that these standards will actually circumvent legislation? Thank you. That was my question and comment.
Thank you so much. Also for the clarification. On that note, maybe we can go to Jochen for a response on this question regarding the relation between standards and regulation.
Yeah, sure. Tough question. I would have hoped I have one more speaker to think about the response. Let me put it this way. I would not think that standards circumvene regulation, because standards, either you have standards that support the marketplace, the uptake of technology, they define basic principles which should be applied by industry or everybody in order to meet the high standards, and they reflect a consensus of the technical experts working on this. If we look at regulation and standardization in the typical way how standardization works, it looks at regulation or also at policy objectives and takes these objectives or essential requirements in regulation, and then the technical experts look at how they can be realized in the technical way. So normally they complement each other. They are not necessarily, they are not really circumvening each other. Now your question is probably more what happens if the standards come before the regulation? Well, yeah, then the standards sort of set a certain direction, but also in the past, usually what we have seen is that either regulation goes stronger. GDPR, for instance, put some additional requirements to security and privacy, and then additional standards were developed, or standards were modified in a way to meet these additional requirements. They were not there yet in standardization, or new standards be developed. So I think usually they complement each other, and there are not conflicts or circumvening them. And apart from that, I agree with everything that was said before. Training data, level of accuracy, transparency, these are all important topics. And again, standards are being under development, and maybe some requirements are being put up by policymaking first, probably maybe in regulation, to say, make sure that your data is not biased, does avoid bias. But it's then again a process, right? And bias is very different. I always wonder if you apply an AI system for a normal community, you should have sort of half male, half female. But maybe there are even other rules for bias if you think of other specialized groups. If it is only for, let's say, a boys' school, something like this, making up a stupid argument here. But bias can be relative, and this is also important to look at. Or if you want to apply something in the automotive world, you probably cannot collect the data in England because they drive on the other hand side from the continent. Yeah? These kind of things. So it's hard to give a general rule. It's more a relation rule, or test your data against bias. These kind of things that I would see. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the response to this important question, but also to touching on the big question of bias. That is something we need to bring into the discussion. Jovan, you also wanted to come into this question on standardization and regulation. So over to you, Jovan.
That's fascinating discussion. Thank you, Kasia, Johan, to opening it, because standardization is sometimes a politician's easy tool to park the difficult question. Let's technicians do with standards. It is changing very fast, especially with the latest ITU internet discussion, where Huawei and big Chinese companies are moving big time into standardization process. For a long time, it was just technical issues for technicians. Now everybody is realizing that through standards, you can create a new reality. In the past, it was VHS or whatever standards, but now it is with AI reality which shapes our almost daily existence. Therefore, that gap, this interplay, dance, which started as a tango with Johannes' intervention and Kasia, is going to, there will be more and more stepping on each other's toes in that respect between regulation and standardization. In this context, we are starting quite in-depth discussion on standardization and AI and cybersecurity in Geneva by bringing usual suspects, ISO, ITU, International Electronic Commission, but also hidden actors. I'm based in the building of World Meteorological Organization. They are one of the earliest players in the field of AI and numerical analysis. And they have this week conference on the future of data and AI standards for WMO, World Meteorological Organization. Therefore, there are many niches in the health, in trade, in the other fields, which are completely disconnected. In brief, we will have more, unfortunately, politicization of the standards discussion, but we have to prepare for it, to train diplomats, to train technical people, and to make this interplay smoother and to continue with the nice tango and not to step on each other's toes in the coming nice tango between regulation and standardization.
Thank you, Jovan. And when you dance, sometimes you just have to step on each other's feet, and that's also part of the process, I guess. Just to remind everyone of the two questions we had from the audience, to also bring them back into the discussion. We had one question about accidental breakthroughs and if deregulation in AI would actually help in bringing about these accidental breakthroughs and therefore create positive change. We also had a question on AI for good. I would like to hand over to our next speaker, Aldo, again, from the perspective of an entrepreneur. Perhaps you also have something to say about standardization, the relationship between standardization and regulation. But over to you, Aldo, for some last words, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a topic, again, that it's very difficult to generalize all the different applications, okay? So there's some of them are critical and are, represent critical systems. Some of them, are more internal competitive analytics tools. So it's AI, when we talk about AI, we talk about an end-to-end system that has at its own core a learning procedure with the machine. So it can basically be applied to many, many things. But I think, standardization, regulation, they should be, I think that there is the data part, as already has been mentioned regarding data privacy policy, etc. It has already been covered by previous regulation. We saw the effort with the GDPR lately, but what's missing now, it's that part related to robustness and ethics, okay? So robustness meaning in critical system, we need to make sure that the algorithm, and not the algorithm, the model, which is the algorithm plus the data on which the model have been learning on, they have to be robust. And let's talk about autonomous vehicles, which is something that we kind of understand, that all of us can understand. We need to make sure that the autonomous vehicle is as performing as a driver, okay? We don't want it to make any accident. Can you imagine having accident coming from a robot? That would create a sort of big problem. So robustness has to be defined. And it's not only a matter of standards, it's a matter of regulating what robustness means and how we can ensure, we can regulate a system to be robust, okay? And that's really important for critical systems, so autonomous vehicles, but there are many, many others that we can think of in production chains, for example, in production lines, when you want to automate part of the production lines using machine learning. And then there is a part of ethics, which is as fascinating, but is not probably only related to critical systems, no? And there, I think the standards are less and less important and regulation becomes more and more important. Let's think about credit scoring, okay? So I've been reading a bit the chat and I saw people talking about bias in data, which then are reflected in the way the model and the AI system behaves, okay? So on the ethical aspects, credit scoring is critical. If we keep using the past data, okay, to give microcredit to people, we will only give it to white men with a certain level of income, and that's unacceptable. We want microcredit to be given also to new, let's say, part of the population that may want to become small entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs. So credit scoring is a good example on that aspect, because if we would be doing this in Europe today, we will only be giving credit to white men, and that's clearly not acceptable. So we need to be able to understand how to create a stronger framework from an ethical perspective to make sure that this technology can be used for good, okay? So, and I try to connect it and relink it to the AI for good aspect. This can be triggered, that can be pushed also by having the right regulations that are mandatory. A standard is something that you want to refer to. A regulation is a mandatory, is kind of mandatory for those who have to comply with it. And I think on both on robustness, just to wrap up, on robustness and on the ethical aspects, we need regulation to make sure that systems are performant and they're also ethically acceptable.
Thank you so much. We are actually already over time, so my sincere apologies to everyone who's watching and participating. I hope you allow me to steal 2 more minutes from your coffee break. This is also a reminder that during the coffee break, we will continue this conversation in an informal chat in another room. The link will be posted shortly in the chat. So not to steal too much time from your coffee break, I would like our last 2 speakers to be very, very concise, perhaps 1 minute or less for a quick final comment, and then we continue the discussion over the coffee break. So Ron, any, so to speak, final words from you?
I'll just say that I think we have neglected the other direction of the connection between AI and policy, or AI and regulation, which is using AI in governance, using AI to help make policy, help to engage in regulation. So this is has occurred already with mixed results in various countries of using AI systems to make decisions about parole worthiness or recidivism and things like this. So all I'll say is that this is going to become, I'll continue my role as a near-term futurologist, and this is going to become more and more of a phenomenon, I think, and it will eventually meet the direction of AI and policy that we've been talking about so far. That is, you'll have AI systems helping to regulate and govern and implement policy about AI systems. So this is an area that we need to be thinking about now, I think, where you combine both directions of this connection between AI and policy.
Thank you so much. And then over to Jochen for any final words from you. Not Jochen, sorry, Christian. Christian, please.
Thank you.
My apologies.
No problem. Well, there will be a lot to say, but just very briefly on the issue of standardization and application of the existing law. Maybe links to the example given by Aldo. So the problem for us is, of course, there are a lot of new regulations on the way. So when I'm saying we should focus on the existing regulation is there, that's only a part of it. But the problem is, and that's been given by the example by Aldo of the credit scores. I mean, first, how do you really separate AI from other technologies? And bias, discrimination, robustness, that's generally a statistical problem. And firms or banks could use statistics for many years. And so how from a regulatory point of view, can you separate between these technologies where you don't even know what AI actually is? So that's just the challenge. And I think the crucial work and the hard work to do is to really identify what is new about AI. And I think with regard to the data protection law, that's actually the approach that works. So you have separated out issues that are really new, that are real problems that the regulator has to deal with, but it's also being done in a rather general way. So that's the only way to ensure that the regulator does not always lag behind the technological development.
Thank you. I think these are great final words. So once again, apologies for intruding into the coffee break. We will be back with the next session in 10 minutes, starting at 3:30 CET, on data privacy and consumer protection, moderated by Professor Elliott. But as I mentioned, we have some time over the coffee break to continue an informal discussion with our speakers. So please stay tuned for the link. I think the link has already been posted in the chat. So if you want to join us for that informal conversation with our speakers, please join us in that Zoom room, and then be back at 12:30 again for the continuation of the next panel. Thank you so much to our excellent speakers, and thank you, our audience, for your comments and questions. It's been an absolute pleasure.